Welcome to the Old Roads Podcast, a podcast that seeks to bring the wisdom of the past to the challenges of the present. I am your host, Aaron O'Kelly. I'm a pastor and a theological educator. As is customary on the last Monday of the month, we're going to do a Q&A episode today, so I have 3 questions here in my formerly Cheeto-stained fingers that I'm going to work through today. Thank you, as always, for submitting questions. First one, can you explain how we should approach the objection that the Bible condones slavery, or that it doesn't explicitly condemn it? Most of us know about the prohibition on man-stealing, but what about the other laws that regulate slavery, like in Exodus 21? And that's a great and very thoughtful question, because this issue is an important one for biblical authority. If we start apologizing for the Bible, or if we start saying that the Bible didn't quite get it right on this issue, then we're opening ourselves up to the objection that, well, the Bible could be wrong on a whole host of issues. And so the way we unpack the Bible's teaching on slavery has a very important apologetic purpose as we defend its moral authority on everything else. First of all, I want to say what we must not do on this question. We must not fall into the trap of what is called a trajectory hermeneutic, or a trajectory way of interpreting the Bible. The trajectory hermeneutic is an approach that says the Bible doesn't ever land on a clear moral teaching, but it gives us a direction, and we can project out from there what that direction would end up as. And projecting where it would end up is where we then go for our moral teaching. The problem with that is you could pretend that there's a trajectory for anything. Some have used that same argument to say, well, the Bible doesn't say that women can be pastors, but it does push us in that direction, and it gives a trajectory so we can go beyond the Bible to where it was actually pointing us. And then others take it even farther and say, well, the Bible doesn't show us that same-sex relations are okay or morally permissible or good, but we could follow its trajectory on certain teachings about companionship or love or commitment or so forth and arrive at that conclusion. And so the trajectory hermeneutic is really a subjective thing, and it's something that's used to justify things that the Bible never justifies. So I'm not going to argue for a trajectory hermeneutic on slavery as we approach the Bible in this question. I do think what we should do, first of all, in addressing this question is recognize why slavery is morally repulsive to modern people. Why is it that for most of the world's history, people at least understood slavery as a fact of life, but today we are repulsed by it? Well, there are a number of reasons. One, of course, is historical. We can look back on the wickedness of the African slave trade, a process that involved kidnapping and stealing human beings, selling them property. Even the Confederacy that defended the institution of slavery condemned the slave trade in its original Constitution. So it's long been recognized, even by pro-slavery Christians, that the slave trade itself had real problems biblically. And so we recognize the wickedness of the African slave trade. We recognize the racism that's inherent in American slavery. Sometimes that racism is driven by animosity. White people who simply had great animosity toward black people and thought of them as subhuman, and therefore they were able to own them and abuse them. But sometimes that racism was more paternalistic. So white people might profess to have great affection for black people in that day and say, well, the poor black people can't handle life on their own, so they need the white people to care for them and oversee them. And that's why slavery is a good thing, because if we let them go into the world on their own, they'll never make it. Well, that's a different kind of racism, but it's still racism. It's still viewing black people as inferior inherently. So the racism is another reason we are repulsed by slavery. We are also repulsed by the abusive practices that many American slave owners tolerated or engaged in themselves. Many times, slaves had no sexual protection from their masters, which is a horrifying thing to contemplate. And that's been the case in many slave cultures. Or the practices involved in giving slaves terrible conditions to live in and abusively treating them. All of these different practices that were often associated with slavery in the American South are reasons that we're repulsed. Now, if you get down to the actual definition of slavery, which is some kind of forced labor or service, The concept itself, I think, is offensive to modern people. The concept of being forced to work without the freedom to leave that arrangement. However, it's interesting to note, we are not as opposed to this idea as we may think. Most people, I think, are not as morally opposed to the idea of military conscription. So is it conceivable that there may have to be a draft at some point in the future? Or, of course, we have had drafts as recently as, I believe, the 1960s and 70s here in America. We had draft into military service. What is that if it's not some kind of a coerced, it's a forced service to your country? Is that a form of slavery? And yet, modern people are not as offended at that as they are at the idea of slavery itself. What if you live in a society that doesn't have the structures of, say, bankruptcy law, and so in order to pay off debts, you go into a period of forced labor? Is that something that's terribly morally repulsive? I don't think it is. I think that could be a possible way to pay off debts. What about if you're in prison and you're forced to work? You don't have any freedom to get out of that. Most modern people are not as repulsed by that idea as they are at simply using the term slavery. So what I think happens is the basic concept of slavery, which is simply some kind of forced labor that you can't pull out of, that idea is being conflated with all the abuses that I just mentioned that are tied up with the African slave trade, racism, with the way the abuses were tolerated in American slavery in the South. I think modern people have trouble separating the concept itself from all of the things that are rightly morally repulsive. But if we can separate those out, we can begin to understand a lot better how does the Bible address this in a way that is not morally repulsive. Well, in the Old Testament, there are laws given to Israel that regulate an existing institution of slavery. But I would argue that it regulates that institution in very humanitarian ways. That is, compared to the way slaves and slavery were regulated in other nations, Israel's law had a very high ethic, and it required that owners recognize the dignity of their slaves. And as the questioner indicated in the question, Exodus 21 is one passage where you see those laws laid out. Now, sometimes those laws can be difficult for us to interpret because of our inability to understand the context in which they're given. So for this, instead of walking through that, it would take us too long for me to walk through that passage in great detail. I'm just going to refer you to another resource that I hope many of you will go listen to or watch, and it's a YouTube video. It's entitled, Does the Bible Support Slavery? And it's a lecture by Peter Williams. And it gives great insight into the biblical teaching, and Peter Williams shows how the Old Testament law actually is a humanitarian regulation of an existing practice of slavery. Now, when you move into the New Testament, there's no legislation on slavery because we're not dealing with the same kind of documents. The Old Testament includes the Mosaic covenant given to Israel, the nation, giving them laws to abide by as a nation. There's nothing like that in the New Testament because in the New Testament, the documents are written to Christian believers who are scattered among all nations. And they're under the overarching authority of the Roman Empire. So there's no legislation on slavery in the New Testament because we don't have legislative documents, but we do have commands given to believers in the New Testament letters. And the commands to slave owners, because slavery was a part of the Roman world as well, the commands to slave owners were to treat their slaves well, to treat them with dignity. Ephesians 6 verse 9, Colossians 4 verse 1. There are clear warnings to slave owners not to abuse their slaves. In addition to that, you have the whole letter of Philemon. Now, in Philemon, Paul is sending a runaway slave, Onesimus, back to his master. Onesimus has come to Christ. And there's some debate about what exactly he's asking Philemon to do, but at a minimum, we know he is to receive Onesimus back. And Paul even says, receive him back as a brother in verse 16 of Philemon. Many have argued, and there's a very strong case that can be made, that Paul is appealing to Philemon to release Onesimus, no longer treat him as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. And so there is a clear teaching in the Bible that if you live in an existing state where slavery is a reality, then you are required to treat your slaves well. You're required, if they're believers, to treat them as brothers and sisters. But there's no blanket command that you have to free all slaves. That's not anywhere in the New Testament. And I think the reason for that is because The New Testament was not written to reorder society. It was written to give believers instructions on how to live in the context they were in. And so the early church did not try to abolish the institution of slavery. It did not try to create a moral revolution in society, but it sought to teach people how to be faithful in the context they were in at the time. And that definitely means that they should not be engaged in all the practices related to slavery that we rightly find biblically and morally repulsive that I mentioned a while ago, the slave trade, racism, and the abusive practices. But the fact that we do have some toleration for some forms of forced labor in our understanding shows that that a blanket condemnation, a blanket prohibition on slavery per se, is not actually what we should expect in a fallen world. Now, slavery was not present from the beginning of creation. In the Garden of Eden, there's no slavery, and there's no slavery in the new creation. But it does seem that as long as we live in a fallen world, slavery in some form will exist. Now, in America, we have ended the institution of slavery, and I think we're much better for it. But as I mentioned earlier, there are still forms of it that still exist, and those forms may be a necessity as long as we live in a fallen world. So thank you for that question. I'm going to put a link to Peter Williams' lecture in the show notes, and so please go find that and listen for more on that question. Here's a second one. What are your thoughts on cussing? I've heard some Christians say it's sinful. I've heard other Christians make arguments for why it's okay at times. And that's a good question. How should we think about the way we speak? Well, let's start with some biblical principles. Number one, Christians should not speak in ways that are crude. And I draw this from Ephesians 5, verses 3 and 4. But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. Many cuss words, as we call them, are shocking to our sensibilities because they are strong ways of describing matters related to sexuality or human excrement or something like that. They would qualify as filthiness of speech. Christians should not engage in this kind of speech that is shocking for the sake of degrading sexuality or talk of bodily functions or so forth. That's something we should avoid because of the Bible's warning to us not to be crude in our speech. In addition to that, number two, Christians should not speak harshly out of anger. In Matthew 5, 21 and 22, Jesus tells us, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder,' and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the hell of fire." Jesus is speaking here about the dangers of us speaking to others in anger. Cuss words are often used to express anger, and I believe Christians should not speak in these ways as it shows a lack of self-control and being driven by passions rather than having our passions ordered properly. So I think those are the two main principles I would articulate here. We should not speak crudely, that is, to shock those who hear us, to shock their moral sensibilities for the sake of getting a reaction. There may be occasions when speaking strongly is warranted. For example, Paul will say in Galatians that he wishes those who are pressing circumcision on Gentile believers would emasculate themselves, castrate themselves. That's a very strong image, but he's using it to make a strong theological point. And so there are times when strong terms, strong images, strong language is warranted, but we need to check our motives. Are we trying to be crude just to be crude? Are we speaking out of anger and so trying to speak as harshly as we can because we're angry? If we are, I think we are sinning. And so we need to check our hearts in that. Having said all that, is there a definitive list of words that we should never use at any time? Well, there are certain words I don't ever use and I will never use, but I don't think the issue is really the words themselves. And that's because language changes over time and different contexts will warrant different norms of speech. So here's an example from when I was younger. I used the word crud one time when I was at a friend's house, and I was actually quoting a Christian song by the Christian artist Carmen. I don't know if you remember Carmen, but he had a song that used the word crud, and my friend reacted when I said that very strongly. And the reason he did was because his parents had told him not to use that word. They didn't want him developing patterns of speech. And so if that is the norm in your family, if you're a child and that's what your parents tell you, there's certain words you're not to use, even words that we wouldn't even put on the cuss word list, then you need to obey your parents and you need to do what they tell you. You need to say, my speech will be regulated by what my parents say is good and right for me to use at this time. And maybe when I get older, I'll learn how to use words rightly. But for now, I'm going to obey what they tell me. So the norms of speech can change depending on how old you are, depending on your context, your situation. So I don't want to say there's a definitive list of words that we should never use and versus words we can. Rather, the question is, what is the nature of the speech act in which you're engaging? What are you actually doing with your speech? Are you trying to shock and offend to get some kind of reaction for the sake of just being crude? Are you trying to win a cheap laugh? Are you trying to vent your anger on someone else with unrestrained speech? These are the matters over which we should guard our hearts. And I think that's how we should approach that particular question. And then a third one here. How do we get 3 days and 3 nights from Friday to Sunday? Now, the reference here would be to Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 to 40. Jesus says, or it says here about Jesus, then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. To say that he's in the heart of the earth means he's in the tomb. So there's going to be a parallel. There's going to be a way that Jesus fulfills the type of the prophet Jonah. Jonah's time of 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of the fish is a picture of Jesus' time in the tomb from which both emerged alive again. So Jesus says 3 days and 3 nights he will be in the tomb. How can that be possible if he went into the tomb on Friday evening and he came out of the tomb on Sunday morning? If you count that, that's 2 nights, and that's 1 full day and a part of 2 days. Well, that would have taken a lot longer to say, wouldn't it? So it's really just a figure of speech. It's a round way of speaking to refer to any part of 3 days. It's interesting that Jesus himself saw no conflict between saying 3 days and 3 nights here in Matthew 12 and then saying on the third day in Matthew 16:21. Well, if it's on the third day, it's obviously not going to encompass all 3 nights. But Jesus didn't see any contradiction between speaking those 2 different ways because both of them are simply round ways of speaking or figures of speech. So yes, technically he was in the tomb 1 day, portions of 2 other days, and 2 nights. But the phrase 3 days and 3 nights can colloquially summarize that same time period, especially in the Jewish reckoning where a part of a day counts for a whole day. I think it'd be similar to if someone said to you today, I went to the University of Tennessee for 4 years. Well, what does he mean by that? He doesn't mean that he was for 4 entire years a student at the University of Tennessee. I would assume he enrolled in the fall semester, which probably began in August of a certain year, and he graduated in May of a year sometime later, and he probably didn't attend classes during the winter breaks and during the summer breaks. And so you can speak in a round way of, I was at University of Tennessee as a student for 4 years, when you don't actually mean precisely 4 years. You mean a time period that we all understand when we use that phrase, 4 years. Well, I think the same is true in the first century context. To say 3 days and 3 nights, that can encompass the parts of the 3 days that Jesus was actually in the tomb. As always, thank you for your questions. And if you have a question, I would love to answer it on a future podcast for you. Please submit that at theoldroadspodcast.com. You can also support us as a patron if you go there, if you want to support this ministry financially. And as always, I would encourage you to subscribe on your favorite app, leave us a 5-star review, and most importantly, to help others find this podcast, share this with a friend. Until next time, remember Jeremiah 6:16. Thus says the Lord, stand by the roads and look and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and find rest for your souls.